Hello and welcome to DRJ's webinar series. I'm John Seals with the Disaster Recovery Journal. Today's sponsor is AlertMedia. They will discuss preparing for the 2025 threat landscape. To welcome and introduce our panelists today, I'd like to turn it over to Katie Goen.
Thank you so much, John. And hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Katie Goen, Director of Content and Communications at AlertMedia. I will be your moderator today. And I just want to thank everyone right off the bat for joining us for this discussion about preparing for the 2025 threat landscape. Our speakers have some fantastic data and content for us today, which is all based on findings from AlertMedia's 2025 Threat Outlook Report. And this year it's titled The Cascade Effect, Emerging Trends in the Threat Landscape. So let's get right into it. I'd love to introduce you all to today's speakers. First, we have Sara Pratley with us today. Sara is Senior Vice President of Global Intelligence at AlertMedia, where she leads a team of experienced analysts who are responsible for monitoring and alerting on emerging threats and incidents worldwide. Before joining AlertMedia, Sara was the Vice President of National News at CNN. Hi, Sara, welcome.
Thanks, Katie. Excited to be here and go through the report today.
Well, we're so glad that you're here. And I'd also like to introduce Peter Steinfeld, Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions at AlertMedia. Peter's been in the communications industry for more than 20 years now, and he's helped organizations of all sizes and industries level up their employee safety, business continuity, and emergency preparedness initiatives. He is also the host of the Employee Safety Podcast here at AlertMedia. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Great to be here, and apologies to the audience for my allergy-induced scratchy voice today, but should be able to get through everything just fine.
Sounds good. Thanks for the heads up, Peter. Well, I do want to quickly walk through today's agenda. First, we're going to talk about the cascade effect, what it is and its role in today's threat environment. We're going to talk about 6 primary threats that are shaping preparedness efforts for next year. We'll talk about some emerging threats on our radar and why they should be top of mind for organizations. And then finally, just how to prepare your people and your business for 2025. So before we get into the content, I do want to go ahead and launch our first poll for the day. All right, we are asking, do you feel more or less prepared to protect your people from emerging threats than you were at this time last year? You could say, more prepared, you can say less prepared, or maybe it's about the same. So I will just give that a few more seconds so you guys can get your answers in. And I think let's go ahead and share those results now. And I'm going to ask our speakers for their opinions on them.
Yeah, I'll jump in first.
Yeah.
Sorry, Katie. I was going to say I'll jump in first, save Peter his voice for a second. It's great to see that so many people, 43% are more prepared. That's wonderful. I think seeing about the same is interesting. Obviously, some room for growth. And then that smaller amount that feels less prepared, I'd be interested to know maybe on the side how people are feeling kind of with how you get more prepared, right? But really interesting to just kind of see all 3 represented there. Peter, I don't know if you've had anything to add.
Yeah, what I would add is that oftentimes when people say they're less prepared, it's because they last year realized they had a lot of work to do, and it opened their eyes to more things that were necessary that they weren't considering before. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes when you realize what you don't know, you can now work on it and improve it. So it's all good.
Such a good point.
And interestingly here, the data just changed slightly, and now it's 43 and 44% for more prepared and about the same. So that's definitely interesting. Well, thank you guys for participating in those. I'm going to now turn it over to Peter, who's going to talk about the cascade effect and why that was just a major theme for the 2025 Threat Outlook Report.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Katie. We'll get things set up here before Sara gets into the actual report itself. But as threats continue to grow in scale, frequency, and complexity worldwide, business resilience really takes on a new urgency. And that's why AlertMedia releases the annual Threat Outlook Report that examines data and trends from the last year in order to understand the upcoming threat potential for next year. So with these insights, you can better anticipate challenges, bolster your risk management strategies, and then enhance your organization's ability to thrive. As we were working with these different subject matter experts to compile this year's report, we realized that many critical events of 2024 involved what we call the cascade effect, which I'll explain more on the next slide here. So essentially, the cascade effect is a chain of events that occurs as a direct or maybe indirect result of a primary event or inciting incident. For example, lightning strikes a power line and causes a power outage. As a result of the electrical failure, a traffic light somewhere is out and a car crashes, injuring a driver. So in this instance, the lightning strike is the primary incident, and the power outage, the car crash, and the injury are the cascading impacts. Pretty simple example, but I think it makes sense. In today's threat landscape, a single incident can trigger a cascade of impacts that reverberate across industries and regions and can get really complex. So, looking at 2024 events specifically, these 5 examples of the cascade effect really stand out. First is the Israel-Hamas conflict. The attack on October 7, 2023 was the primary event for the war, which resulted in a lot of cascading impacts ranging from broader conflict in the Middle East and supply chain disruptions to humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and then worldwide protests. Next you see here is the CrowdStrike outage. The inciting incident obviously was the faulty software update release causing a huge, just widespread glitch. And then the cascade effect caused everything from complete work stoppages to flight cancellations, which I got tied up in, to non-functioning hospitals, not good, and a lot of other important services worldwide. The UK riots, another example. The primary event was a stabbing attack in Southport that killed 3 children and injured several more. Cascading impacts range from hate speech and the spread of misinformation to extremist violence and hundreds of arrests. Another, Hurricane Beryl. The Cat 5 hurricane made landfall in Texas, which was the inciting incident, and the cascade effect caused things like tornado outbreaks, flooding, power outages, and heat-related deaths and injuries. And then lastly, the recent Mexico elections. Mexico held its general elections back in early June, so that was the primary event, but it cascaded into record levels of political violence, the entire federal judiciary going on strike, major protests, and a lot of concerns about trade agreements with other countries. So again, these crises demonstrate how a single event can have a really widespread ramification and a lot of long-lasting business impacts. So I'm certain we're going to see a lot more of these examples of the cascade effect in 2025. Now, for AlertMedia's 2025 Threat Outlook report, we identified these 6 prominent trends from 2024 that influenced employee safety, physical security, and business continuity that we think will continue to shape preparedness efforts for the coming years as you start planning. So we'll be exploring each of these trends at a very high level throughout today's presentation. So with that said, Sarah, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you to get us started with our first trend.
Wonderful. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate you setting the stage. So let's go ahead and start with climate. This tends to affect every organization, no matter our size, our location, or our industry. So a great place for us to start. And to start, here's a rather eye-opening data point. So new reports estimate that climate change is increasing at an alarming rate, something that I think we're all very familiar with, but with human-induced warming increasing by 0.26 degrees Celsius. That's per decade. So the extreme weather and natural disasters caused by this shift pose a universal risk to organizations around the world. These events cause immediate harm to the lives of those impacted, of course, but also have really long-term and far-reaching effects. Some of that cascade effect impacted there as well. 2024 is also on track to be the hottest year on record. We're shattering those records month after month, now year after year. According to the World Health Organization, heat stress is the leading cause of weather-related deaths. These sorts of fatalities have increased by 117% in the United States since 1999, so just over the past few decades. And then in Europe, they could actually triple these sorts of deaths by the end of the century, so a huge uptick there as well. Heat impacts, or heat waves, also have impacts on infrastructure, really disrupting things like air travel and tourism, damaging roads, damaging bridges that supply chains, of course, depend on, and then, of course, putting critical data centers at risk of overheating, a lot of risk there. Additionally, another important connection, increasing global temperatures are exacerbating seasonal allergies as well as mosquito-borne illnesses, so that connection there between climate and health as well. So as our global temperatures rise, increased evaporation really can lead to flooding or drought, really both ends of the extremes on the spectrum here. When we have more water suspended in the atmosphere, a little science lesson for us here, we see significantly heavier rainfall events and catastrophic flooding around the globe. In May and again in September of this past year, severe flooding events swept across Europe. I'm sure many of you remember the pictures and the devastating images. Many of those led to evacuations, structural damage, and more than a dozen deaths in those areas. And of course, we had the most recent flooding in Spain as well, with more than 100 deaths. Parts of South Asia also saw severe flooding and landslides from a heavy early monsoon season too. And then on the other hand, the Mediterranean, places in North Africa, and also parts of South America have faced catastrophic drought conditions throughout the summer in particular this year. In Italy, 25% of agricultural production was lost due to water restrictions, costing upwards of 2.7 billion euros. So huge impacts there just in one country. And then prolonged drought conditions in places like Brazil in particular, saw the devastation of more than 180,000 total wildfires from January to August, causing air quality concerns, also flight and travel disruptions, and then driving potential energy crisis issues as well. The 2024 Atlantic hurricane season, on the other hand, saw a record-breaking start. It seems a little far off, right? It started so long ago, but a huge season here in the United States, across Mexico and Canada too in particular. But Hurricane Beryl was the earliest Category 5 storm in history. Peter mentioned this earlier. The destructive season continued with several intense storms in October, including hurricanes like Helene and Milton, which we all, of course, remember. Thankfully, the season has ended, but not before 5 hurricanes made landfall in the United States alone. And then in Asia, typhoons Yagi and Marseille proved even more catastrophic, bringing really intense flooding, landslides throughout places like the Philippines, China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, the list goes on and on. Damage there to homes, to different structures, roads, bridges, dams, the power grid, farmland. And that was only amplified as the respective areas in these respective storm seasons continued with more severe weather that had already hit these regions. Common wisdom has been that it takes only one bad storm to cause a crisis, but with the effects of climate change, we seem to be dealing with back-to-back incidents, very little recovery time between each one, and then a waterfall of impacts in local regions and really well beyond those regions in many cases as well. All right, the next prominent threat on our list is the rising global election tensions, as 2024 was a landmark year for elections worldwide, and we've of course got more to come. So more than 70 countries held national elections in 2024. That was over 4 billion people that were actually eligible to vote worldwide. Huge numbers of people going to the polls this past year. Some of those in countries with flaring political tensions. Elections, of course, can also, in those situations, spark violence and sometimes disruption in many cases. So here's what we can expect for more countries that are actually going to the polls in national elections in 2025. So unfortunately, with extremism, and polarizing political rhetoric on the rise, both domestically and abroad, organizations are really likely to face ongoing risks related to civil unrest and a volatile geopolitical landscape in the year ahead. A few examples, as Peter mentioned earlier, the 2024 elections in Mexico saw significant violent activity. There were more than 330 incidents of violence against political figures. So really astounding numbers there. That's actually the highest level of political violence ever recorded in Mexico. And then in the United States, as many of us remember and are aware, there were 2 assassination attempts plus a foiled assassination plan from Iran against former President Trump before the presidential election. So just 2 examples of what we've seen over the past year. 2024 featured really widespread and disruptive civil activism surrounding global elections as well. In France, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest the far-right movements leading up to the elections in June and July. Germany saw a similar explosion of protests in response to the growing support for their far-right party, Alternative for Germany, AfD, and protests there are expected to accelerate leading up to the election in September of 2025. And actually, it looks like that election could be moved up due to a lot of the political complications and strife happening in Germany right now. The disruption caused by protests and demonstrations for any cause, right, can have significant impacts to things like travelers in an area, to supply chains, of course, to business operations in those areas, particularly if any of those incidents lead to violence. So as we've seen these numbers in times in the past few years, or as we've seen with numbers, cyber attacks on political candidates, social media manipulation and things of that nature, as well as cyber espionage have played roles in elections around the globe. So foreign and domestic actors have also used misinformation as well as disinformation for everything from spreading false information about the voting process and campaign platforms, as well as political connections to even false acknowledgments of election losses. So a lot that we've seen at play there. And these influences elevate the risks for surrounding elections by exacerbating political divides, leading to more volatility and really to a lot more civil disruption in these areas. They can also increase confusion and the disenfranchisement of groups that are already feeling marginalized in those areas. And as generative artificial intelligence tools, something we talk about a lot, they make it a lot easier to create that falsified information. The need for vigilance in this area and against these threats is only increasing as we approach the elections in 2025. All right, moving on, another trend we identified in the report is geopolitical strife, particularly as it relates to multiple ongoing conflicts that are happening in the world around us. So some quick data to kick this one off. Geopolitical stability continues to decline in 2024. It's just the reality that we live in. Peacefulness deteriorating in nearly 100 countries, including 23 in European nations. Organizations cannot function in isolation, and the rippling impacts of war and civil instability are going to continue throughout 2025. There's no doubt about that, really resulting potentially in extensive costs to organizational security as well as global supply chains. We really live in such an interconnected world there. The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and the constantly evolving conflict in the Middle East, these were two of the most discussed topics at a recent security conference that I attended with a lot of global security professionals. Both of these conflicts causing widespread refugee crises, cyber threats, and hugely important for global businesses, supply chain disruptions. I think it's quite clear to all of us that neither of these conflicts is slowing down. We're seeing near evolution of these and upticks of these things nearly every day. They've also spurred massive global protests, especially the crisis and the conflict in the Middle East, something I'm sure many of you who are tuning in have actually experienced as a part of your business to some degree, either directly or indirectly. Much of this leading to various scales of disruption locally, but in many instances, we've seen some of these incidences turning violent too, which is concerning for all businesses located in areas that demonstrations could break out at any given point in time or that are planned. And then supply chain, one of the most complicated topics we try to unravel day in and day out, especially as we see the evolving conflict in the Middle East, attacks in the Red Sea driving an area that usually sees 1/3 of the world's shipping containers actually forced to take significantly longer routes. More time, of course, equals more money for businesses, which equals more money for consumers. So we're certain to see this aspect in particular continue to impact global businesses in 2025 and beyond. And as we consider the interconnected world that we live in, it's also important to consider terrorism as well. While large-scale terrorist incidents like the deadly concert hall shooting that we saw in Moscow only a few months ago have really lessened in recent years, terrorism is still a clear and present risk in many parts of the world that we live in. Domestic extremist groups are connected to a rise in terrorist threats and activities that pose significant danger to public safety and organizational operations as well. So important to remember and focus on that. The UK in particular has experienced a spike in reports of terrorism as well in the wake of the war happening in the Middle East, those alongside the rise in protests, also rise in hate crimes really attached here as well. And then similarly in the United States, we've seen things like bombs and shooting threats in places like Springfield, Ohio. Many of you will remember the perpetuation of this by some politicians along campaign trails. So a lot at play there as well. So this movement towards more domestic threats will definitely require a different approach to navigating terrorism in 2025. Certainly food for thought there. Okay, let's talk about our next trend, which is economic uncertainty. Spoiler alert here, the economic headwinds of 2024 are very likely to persist as a complex web of geopolitical tensions, policy changes, supply chain disruptions all intertwine. Your organizational resilience will likely rely on your ability to do more with less in some of these areas, even as these threats that we're facing are, of course, increasing in many areas. Okay, so how about a little bit of quick data here? Global disinflation remains uneven in 2024 and has really been exacerbating by protracted wars and softness in labor markets. That's according to the World Economic Outlook update, a really important report that we draw a lot of information from. So consumers and organizations continue to feel that economic strain as prices stay high in many categories. I'm sure many of you are feeling that, specifically with groceries. As you can see here on this graph, the global monthly food price index, this all indicated here. The war in Ukraine has significantly contributed to surging energy prices in Europe as well. And as attacks in the Red Sea have caused about a 66% decline in shipments through the Suez Canal. Really, again, as I mentioned earlier, increasing both shipping times and costs. So a lot at stake there for businesses as well as consumers and people you partner with. Additionally, lagging wages in many countries are leading to workforce retention and morale issues. I'm not sure how many of you are experiencing that now, but certainly something we're keeping a close eye on for the future. And then businesses will most certainly continue to navigate these cost pressures while also dealing with policy uncertainty and the potential fiscal instability considering the ongoing geopolitical tensions that we've talked about in 2025. Again, all very interconnected. Labor activism, this is another area that's intensified both in the United States and really just globally in general. The map that you see here reflects the number of labor strikes in the US alone as of October 1st of this past year. Globally, we saw more than 250 strikes in 2024 in industries including construction, retail, healthcare, manufacturing, and shipping. And these labor challenges have really widespread consequences. The Canadian rail unions shut down strike in September, so just a few months ago. That was estimated to require up to 5 days of recovery for each 1 day of work stoppage. So huge recovery time there. And then on the hiring front, many major US companies in tech, finance, manufacturing, and more really announced significant layoffs as well as hiring freezes amid market contractions. And then in the UK, on the other hand, they're experiencing critical staffing shortages. 51% of HR managers recently reported that retention is a top worry amid record high turnover and vacancy rates. So really kind of both ends of the spectrum there when you think about two completely different locations. And then these global dynamics, I think, really underscore the interconnectedness of these labor markets and then the widespread costs of economic pressures on the workforce and its stability. All right, let's move to cyber. In every industry, cyber attacks are increasing in frequency and cost, really resulting in data breaches that impact millions of individuals, employees, and otherwise. So with security, data privacy, and reputation on the line, organizations really have to continue to prioritize this threat in particular. I know many of you already are and investing in this area too. So I'm sure each of you has consistently heard devastating stats on the number and the impact of cyber crimes. So I'll keep this one brief, but cybercrime does remain a top business threat. It's expected to reach $10.5 trillion in global annual damages in 2025. So huge costs as we continue to see those trends going upward. A recent report showed that there were 2,700 plus publicly disclosed incidents in the US. Those are just the publicly disclosed ones from November of 2023 to April of 2024. Nearly 7 billion known data records that were breached in those attacks. Again, just astounding numbers. Cyber attacks continue to be huge concerns for organizations writ large, no matter the industry. And as this graph from Checkpoint shows, each week, hundreds, if not thousands of organizations around the globe experience some sort of cyber attack. This year alone, high-profile incidents involving large healthcare, large telecom providers exposed vast amounts of sensitive data, impacted millions of users and employees. And whether your role is indirectly or directly involved in your organization's cybersecurity, it's really important to consider how these attacks lead to severe brand and reputation damage on top of the disruption, as well as those recovery costs. So many different things at play when you think about the impacts from cyber. Let's focus really quickly on ransomware. So ransomware attacks became increasingly sophisticated and accessible throughout 2024. The rise of what we call ransomware as a service, I'm sure many of you have heard about this, has really democratized cybercrime, really allowing attackers with minimal expertise to execute devastating strikes. Lots of impact. Double extortion attacks, it's where a criminal encrypts and steals data. Those are becoming more prevalent as well, which puts additional pressure on organizations really attempting to respond and stay on top of these sorts of things. And these attacks are also getting cheaper to deploy while the costs of victims are rising, both from ransom payments, operational dysfunctions too. And as these attacks get increasingly sophisticated and pervasive, organizations continue to really bear the brunt of the cost writ large. And then the last threat we'll focus on today from the report, 2024 revealed significant business vulnerabilities due to operational resilience on physical and digital infrastructures. So massive outages, rising demand, accelerating wear undermine the structural integrity of these critical systems, and organizations should expect increased disruptions as well as more costly recovery in 2025 and beyond. So the IT outage impact study from Logic Monitor found that companies with frequent outages and brownouts experience 16 times higher costs than those facing less downtime. So a pretty important stat there to keep in mind. Organizations, of course, can't control electricity demand on the power grid or the power grid in particular. Plus, some of them are too old to be managed, which of course leads to our next slide. So physical infrastructure threats. The power grids in Europe and the US in particular are up to 50 years old. They require extensive upgrades to keep up with current demand, let alone the projected growth on that demand as well as we keep moving populations. Power outages disrupt business operations and essential services, and they're costly. A single outage at a data center, for example, can cost up to $1 million, with those cascading impacts to customers, to operations down the line, to different partners, different vendors. Extreme weather events such as heat waves, floods, hurricanes, those all exacerbate the weakness in these aging infrastructures, aging bridges, aging roads, aging buildings. And then cyber attacks also pose a growing threat to critical infrastructure globally. Hackers targeting power grids, water treatment facilities, transportation networks, really nothing is out of the realm of possibility these days. As the threats from climate change and bad actors increase, these vulnerabilities really endanger local communities. They have far-reaching economic consequences for things like supply chains as well with the international networks. Incidents such as the CrowdStrike outage, which Peter noted earlier, those really also underscore the fragility of the interconnected IT systems and also reveal just how heavily organizations rely on these digital ecosystems in the tech age. The rapid growth of cloud computing and the Internet of Things, those networks having increased these vulnerabilities as well, making it easier for a single attack or system failure to cascade across the sectors and disrupt critical services. Again, that interconnection, so important there. IT outages can compromise business continuity. They can lead to data loss. It can also halt operations, and it can also result in significant reputational damage. All of these are incredibly costly to organizations. All right, so there we have it. Those are the 6 prominent threats that AlertMedia's team of experts identified as the biggest troublemakers for 2025. So climate change, global election tensions, wars and geopolitics, economic uncertainty, cybercrime, and then those ever important infrastructure vulnerabilities. And with that, Katie, I'm going to take a deep breath, a quick sip of water.
Yes.
And get back to you for a moment.
That was amazing, Sarah. Yes, please take a breather for a moment because I'm going to go ahead and launch our next poll. So let's go ahead and bring that question up now. Which of the 6 prominent threats is the highest priority for your organization right now? Maybe it's those climate extremes. We had to kind of combine wars, geopolitical, and elections in the same answer there, as we just had 5 options here. It could be economic uncertainty as well, maybe cybercrime, Or like Sarah talked about, those infrastructure vulnerabilities, aging infrastructure and power grids. So I'm going to give this just another couple seconds. Looks like folks are finishing up their answers. All right, let's go ahead and end that poll and share the results if we could, please. All right. Cybercrime is by far our biggest, I guess, winner here. I don't know, the biggest selection, let's say. So I'm going to start with you, Peter. What are your thoughts there? Is that what you expected to see?
Yeah, I did. It's every meeting I go to. This is like the number one thing that people say they're worried about because it is, I wouldn't say novel. It's been happening for some time, but the acceleration is insane and the impact that it has is dramatic. So not unexpected at all.
Yeah, and as I'm looking at it here, like climate, economic uncertainty, and infrastructure, those are all coming in right about the same. And then the geopolitics and wars are bringing up the tail end here. Sarah, what do you think about that?
I definitely am not surprised that cybercrime is at the top of the list. I feel like it tops every list when you think about the struggles that organizations have with the risk and the threat landscape. I'm a little bit surprised by climate as I talk to a lot of folks across security and business continuity. I think this is one we're becoming more familiar with how to manage around, but just a lot of the extremes people are talking about, the longevity of different climate incidents, different severe weather incidents, and natural disasters. So that just kind of sparked a thought there for me.
Makes a good point. Thank you so much. All right. Now, Peter, I'm going to turn it back over to you. What else, should be on our radars as we're moving into the new year?
Well, I'd like to call out a few emerging threats that we have our eye on. And first is the state of infectious disease is a really massive emerging threat. The COVID-19 pandemic, as everyone knows, proved just how catastrophic infectious disease can be and how quickly a distant outbreak can really expand with global impact and super high costs for businesses and in productivity loss. Another thing, there's the risk and reward of AI technology. Artificial intelligence can certainly improve efficiency, but there is substantial risk involved when using AI tools, like disseminating mis or disinformation, and of course, data privacy concerns. Threats to business travelers is another example. Travelers face a wide range of threats while on the road, from simple things like, unfortunate travel disruptions to really bad things like terrorism. And what we found is that global business travel is expected to actually increase in 2025, just like it has every year since the pandemic. People are just really getting back out on the road. And then last, this one might be unexpected to a lot of folks, is drone threats. I didn't know about this really myself until I did a podcast about this, but the technical term is unmanned aircraft systems, or UASs. They pose an emerging threat to safety and security for really all types of businesses out there, really all kinds. But they're obviously a specific concern for restricted areas like correctional facilities, airports, critical infrastructure, military locations, but also large open air event centers such as sports arenas. And as I mentioned, I had drone expert Ryan Wallace on the Employee Safety Podcast recently, who we quote in the report, and he told some really wild stories about bad actors using drones and how quickly the technology is evolving. It's almost like cyber attacks. It's just the tech is taking off so fast. Now, I'd like to talk about another threat that I know is important to all of you, especially over the last few years with COVID in mind, and that's burnout. The growing scale of threats that safety, security, and business continuity and resilience teams must manage has really created a very often overlooked consequence, and that's burnout. Employees on these teams are just working to manage and prevent increasingly complex and impactful incidents, and many are doing so with a lot less funding, far fewer resources, and less headcount in recent years. Looking at the numbers here, burnout, stress, and being overwhelmed are industry-wide concerns. One report shows that about 63% of security professionals experience some level of burnout, and about 80% say their workloads have increased in the past year. That's a lot. Another study found that 84% of cybersecurity workers report experiencing stress, fatigue, and burnout, clearly indicated by the poll that we just showed. It's a huge concern for folks. So this impact of invisible internal threats can cascade and compromise the very foundation of safety, security, and all that operational continuity that these teams exist to support. So it's really a double-edged sword there. All right, with that, let's go ahead and switch gears now and talk about some preparedness tips and strategies. So we just spent a lot of time talking about how the threat landscape is evolving, but we should also acknowledge how the workforce has evolved and become a lot more dispersed. To continue fulfilling your duty of care in today's rapidly changing environment, your emergency preparedness, risk mitigation, and employee safety plans should all evolve as well. So today, duty of care extends to remote workers in their home offices, lone workers in the field or on a job site, business travelers wherever they might find themselves in the world, and even your commuters who might rely on aging infrastructure or transportation to the office. If they can't get in on a normal commute day, it's not good for business. So in today's threat landscape, managing a single threat oftentimes means managing a cascade of consequences far beyond the initial event. And we discussed that at the beginning of the presentation. Protecting your people and maintaining operations and achieving overall resilience requires a very multidimensional approach to risk management. So here are 6 strategies that'll help you get closer to those goals and navigate the threats coming up in the new year. So first and foremost, decentralize operations for much more resilient continuity. This reduces the chance of unilateral disruption by reducing your dependency on central hubs and decentralizing essential functions. Next, you want to enhance threat modeling with scenario-based training. This really advances your training and critical event response practice beyond those generic tabletop exercises, which are valuable, but try to take it up a notch. Third, develop geospecific contingencies to improve response. This level of very specific planning ensures quicker and more targeted responses and much better resource allocation. And then fourth, don't forget to prioritize ESG and regulation compliance to prevent any additional risk. Be sure to integrate all those risks that come up in that area into your external threat assessment planning and training. And then next, find your force multipliers out there to maximize efforts wherever you can. Always try to identify and use tools, strategies, or processes that allow your business to achieve a whole lot more with fewer resources. We understand a lot of you are just not getting additional funding or headcount. And then lastly, invest in cross-industry collaboration to share critical insights. Collaborative networks can drive a lot of joint solutions and mitigate sector-specific risks, and then help predict trends before they directly affect your particular business. So in other words, get out of your sandbox and go play in some others. You'll be surprised by what you see and learn out there. So hopefully these strategies resonated with you, or at least gave you some food for thought as we wrap up the calendar year. Katie, back to you.
Thanks, Peter. That is just excellent advice. And I do want to just pause now to launch our last poll so we could get that question up now, because after this, we have our questions and then I have a QR code for you all for the report. So we're asking now, would you like to learn more about how AlertMedia can help you monitor and respond to developing risks? You could say yes, and we will happily get you additional information and everything that you need. You can also just say no, not at this time, and no hard feelings. You know where to find us if you need us. So while we're waiting for folks to get their answers in, why don't you guys think about what amazing questions you want to ask Peter and Sara on the next slide? Because I do see quite a few coming in. All right, let's go ahead and close out this poll, and I'm going to get to our questions now. All right, let's see what we got here. Sara, we had a question earlier on in the presentation that I just wanted to save for the end. Can you just highlight the difference between misinformation and disinformation, just to clarify for everyone?
Yeah, sure. And this is one that comes up a lot. But misinformation really is just the basic sharing of information that's false or misleading. And it's doing it more so unintentionally, whereas disinformation is doing the same thing, but with that intent, doing it with some sort of purpose behind, knowing the information is actually likely not accurate or that it's misleading. So that's just kind of like the simple differentiation between the two terms. We get that question a lot. I know we use these terms a lot as well.
Thank you for clarifying that. And then I'll get to both of you on this, but Peter, I'll start with you. Doesn't it seem like there's more potential now for different types of events that could affect businesses? This person gives the example of civil unrest, power grids, even things like the avian flu. Are you finding that in your discussions with, customers and the community in general?
Yeah, and basically the feedback I typically hear from folks is that there were a lot of these things going on in the past. There were just far fewer people on the planet, and there was
Mm.
a lot less interconnectedness. So when things happen now, they tend to affect a whole lot more people, a lot more substantially. Think about the Malibu fires that are going on right now. That used to be all just open land. And then as they started to sell it off and people built houses, it became more of a problem. If that fire happened 100 years ago, not an issue. I mean, in the context of human life, but now it turns into a dramatic issue. So I'm not sure if that addressed the question, but we
Yeah,
talk
no, I
about
think
that
that's a
a lot.
great example.
Yeah.
Sarah, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add too, I mean, the number of incidents that we see impacting people globally is going up. It's because more is happening, but also there's more prominence put on information flow. So we know about more things happening. And then I think the other thing that's kind of related to what Peter mentioned is the ecosystems of businesses are changing, right? Businesses aren't necessarily just in one location. A lot of organizations work across multiple facilities, multiple regions, multiple vendors that are connected, right? You think about the global supply chain. But also as we've kind of evolved into this society of remote and hybrid work, there's more people in more locations, which means a given business can have more things impacting them because their exposure has just changed so much over time.
It's a great answer. Thank you both for that. This one might be interesting to get both of your perspectives on as well. Besides infrastructures, how do you quantify the cost of human losses and traumas after natural disasters? So I'm not exactly specific about what this person means, but probably just like after they've gone through a lot, maybe had the worst day of their lives in a natural disaster, like how do you kind of quantify that?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there's the financial toll, right? That storms, natural disasters can take naturally on a community, individuals within your work ecosystem. So I think there's kind of hard, fast numbers that you can put into that. I think where it gets harder to quantify is kind of the mental toll or the social toll that that can take on an individual. And then residually, there's the toll that that's going to take on their life, work being a part of that life. So the impact to businesses, say if you have folks, you know, in the midst of these Malibu fires that have had to evacuate, they might be working from a remote location, but they may not be as productive, as engaged, as intact as they would be normally. And I think obviously it's important for businesses to take that into consideration in the moment in, you know, supporting employees, but also when you're thinking about the toll that something can take on your employee population, it goes far beyond being able to quantify those numbers and being able to at least weave into the conversation what that kind of mental toll and work product toll can be taken on the employee.
Hmm.
And that really
Anything to
highlights the
add?
whole idea that the cascade effect, which is you just don't know until the incident happens. Something bad could happen, and it could be like literally one cascade effect, and that's it. Or there could be 432, and the
Right.
impact is going to be dramatically different based on exactly what happens and how many people that impacts. But ultimately, I think the most important thing to do is for folks in our business to tell the C-level suite nothing's ever going to be 100% perfect. There's always going to be incidents that pop up. And if you're expecting a certain level of productivity and perfectiveness, is that a word? Perfectiveness, perfection, all the time, it's not possible. There's always going to be things that pop up that are going to impact our productivity. And we just have to work that into the plan.
Excellent. Sarah, I'm going to ask you this question. I know we have the AI conversation quite a bit on your team. Has the use of AI created a race between bad actors and security teams as to developing mitigation measures and identifying ways to subvert mitigation measures?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. It's a fascinating one to kind of wrap your head around. If I think about it kind of on the fly right now, the answer would be very clearly yes, right? The more that AI is being used, and it's being used in a number of different ways. I'm a fan of AI for so many things, but there are a lot of things that it's being used for that create complications for the business world, right? We hit on cyber threats, the creating of misinformation and disinformation, the, you know, perpetuating of that information. In these circumstances, AI is so accessible to everyone, right? You're using AI in some way, shape, or form, whether you're directly doing it or you don't know that you're doing it. But the accessibility to bad actors, the ability to also refine and perfect different content and information, make things look so real, right? We've seen this in some of the political elections globally. The ability to, you know, replicate voices, to replicate images along with voices. I think the, you know, the ability and the capabilities continuing to grow at such a rapid pace has definitely created that race for business professionals, especially on that security and business continuity realm. How do you, you know, obviously have to, but how do you stay up to date with the latest information information and the latest technology, how do you take into consideration some of the things that you're seeing happening in the global landscape and how those could impact your business? And I think that's probably the best way to look at is keeping yourself informed in these areas. What is the latest and greatest or worse of these technologies and how is it being used? And then thinking through your own workplace, how could this potentially impact us if we were targeted in this way, or if we had employees who were using the technology in this way? I think that's a really easy way to at least stay ahead of it as much as we can. But that race is definitely on. Hopefully it continues to, maybe slow down ever so slightly, but it doesn't look like it will.
Thank you so much for that. Peter, I'm going to go back to a question we got a little earlier when you were talking about duty of care. Can you maybe just dive into that a little bit more, talk about it maybe in layperson's terms, and then how it relates to those dispersed and traveling employees?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, duty of care is really the moral and increasingly legal responsibility to take care of those associated with your business. Could be employees or visitors or even on-site customers. Until recently, there was some concept of duty of care for travelers, although that was mostly around VIPs, and almost none of that went toward remote workers. But that's changed, especially with COVID-19, and the law is pushing things forward as well. There are stories of people who experienced health incidents or even death while working from home, and insurance companies are required to consider those as workplace incidents, not something that would have happened before. These are people just doing like white collar jobs at home. But beyond the legal implications, your business will suffer if people don't feel safe, whether that's in the office or anywhere out there doing business for you. If people don't feel safe, they can't be optimally productive. So it's important to get ahead of it. With just a little bit of investment, you can absolutely improve not only safety, but productivity. It really is a win-win.
Thanks, Peter. And I do want to point out, none of us are lawyers or are attorneys,
Right.
so you might want to consult with your legal team if you have additional questions. Sara, I'm going to go back to you. You touched on, and I think a couple of different threats, third-party risk impacts. Can you talk about that a little more? Like, are there certain threats that you think that is a specific consideration for organizations, or should just that be considered across the board? And then maybe just talk a little bit about what those impacts could be.
Sure. When I think about the third-party risks, right, we all depend on additional vendors, right? We utilize different services, we partner across different landscapes. So that's where a lot of those impacts can truly come into play. We live again in this interconnected world, in this interconnected community, which comes with so many huge benefits, but also exposes us to the risks of other organizations. And I think, CrowdStrike, for better or for worse, continues to be, a good example of this, that one company's, potential issues or failings in certain areas can have that ripple effect on different, businesses, different ecosystems with the way that we work and live globally. I think the biggest thing is the importance of just knowledge, right? Understanding who your partners are, where you're supported globally and technically, so that if you do see something, trending in a different area, you can at least start taking mitigating steps as soon as possible.
That's a great answer. Anything to add there, Peter?
I would say just taking what Sara said a step further, like actively reach out. So if you are expecting something from someone, a supplier, and you see a storm coming, some kind of shipping issue, reach out to them. Hey, is this threat that we have seen out there going to impact your ability to supply what we need? And conversely, if you're providing services out there to someone or delivering things to someone and they need to receive it, and you see something could affect their ability to receive it, actively communicate with them ahead of time. Hey, this threat is coming down the line. Are you going to be able to receive what we need to send you? Are you going to be there when we show up to do this job? And just getting ahead of that can help you recalibrate and decide how you're going to react.
Excellent. Sara, you mentioned that there are some pretty high stakes elections coming up in 2025. So I hate to put you on the spot, but do you happen to know what some of those countries are, when those high stakes elections are coming, anything like that?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of them. Just off the top of my brain, honestly, the biggest one I'm paying attention to right now is Germany. And as I mentioned, kind of earlier in the presentation, it looks like Germany may actually move up their elections. There's a lot at play politically there right now. There's a lot at stake. We've already seen demonstrations around different groups and different politics kind of at play within country. It's also Europe's biggest, economic market. So there's intertwined connections globally when we think about the global economy. So that one is just kind of truly top of mind at this point. A few other places that, I know that I'm keeping an eye on next year: Canada, another big one, Japan, the Philippines, Portugal as well. Those are just a few. I would also just point out one of the best resources to just kind of track and tabulate and get different information on these is the World Election Calendar. It's available online. I would definitely suggest folks that are interested in understanding what the elections are in the upcoming year, because maybe you have different locations, maybe you have different connections in different markets. It's a great resource, a great place to kind of take those into consideration now sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Peter, I'm going to ask you this one. I know you get it all the time. How do we mitigate privacy regulations with personal data collection in the context of threat prevention or communication?
I'll start with what you ended that last question with, which is I'm not an attorney, so I can't tell you any legal advice, but I can share with you, like, over 20 years of experience in the communication field, that if you're collecting people's private data, like their first name, last name, email addresses, phone numbers, home address, things like that, with the full and only intention of communicating them in the event of some kind of emergency, then that's okay. Generally speaking, what we see, the courts agree that it's all right for you to collect that information and reach out to people with that intent. Where you cross the line is when you start to use that information for work-related activities. So as long as you keep that wall in place, you should be perfectly fine. Just make sure that you partner with vendors that do indeed keep that information that is collected private, secured, and encrypted at rest.
Very good. And I can say too, for my own organization, I welcome them contacting me, right, for emergencies or anything that is going to keep myself safe or my family safe or my job safe. I think a lot of employees feel that way, but I won't speak for everyone.
No.
Peter, what are some of the big trends that maybe didn't make the list this year? That's a really good question.
Yeah, I think there's two that we did not talk about, but one was insider threats. I know a lot of bigger enterprise organizations are looking at that and thinking about it. It's just more of an issue with mental health and things like that, corporate espionage. So it's something that people are concerned about, but oftentimes more in the bigger organizations. And then the other one is just destination migration, which we alluded to a little bit of before. A lot of people moving to disaster-prone areas. There used to be hurricanes going through Florida all the time, but there wasn't a huge population there. Now you got so many people living there, especially a lot of folks who never lived or grew up with hurricanes, and they don't know what to expect. So there's a lot of, untested, unchallenged people in these scenarios now having to deal with it, along with millions of other, co-inhabitants. So destination migration is a big one too.
That's a great answer. Thank you. We were talking about drone threats a little while ago as one of the emerging threats. And this is just really interesting with everything going on, right now in New Jersey. And I don't know, do any of you, I don't put you on the spot again, do any of you have thoughts on that, comments on that, like what we're seeing in the Jersey area when it comes to drones?
Yeah, I think the more we're exposed to seeing them, the more heightened our alerts are. And I would just point to Peter's podcast, because it's fascinating hearing from somebody with expertise just about the number of drones that are, flying around in the ethers, not only in war-torn countries, right? We're seeing them used as weapons, but also just around the globe in general. But I think people are becoming more accustomed to seeing them, but also becoming more accustomed to asking questions. And these New Jersey drones that seem to be flying flashing different lights and disappearing once police actually have a beat on them and are trying to track them down. Those, I think, also precipitate the conversation of how hard they are to track, which I know Peter, our expert, got into, right? Like, drones are very accessible to people. It's easy to potentially enhance those to be able to have different capabilities, whether it's dropping leaflets or potentially, weaponizing them, but they're also hard to trace. So I think that's an important element of the conversation as well. And, we're seeing that play out in New Jersey. It's very hard to trace something that just continues to escape when, folks are trying to look for them. So.
Very well said. Well, we have time for one more question. So I want to get to your thoughts on some additional resources, Sara. So how can folks stay current on these trends? Is there like a website or a data report or anything like that you would recommend?
There's several things I would recommend. Our report obviously is amazing. I think we get into a lot of different information about the threats that we outlook today and just kind of the threat landscape in particular. When we think about some of the different things that we showcase in the reports, there's a lot of other good reports and information, documents that people can kind of dive into if you look kind of deeply into these different areas. I come from a media and news background. There's a lot to be said about the different information that's flowing in the world around us, but just in general, finding information that you can trust, I think is incredibly important. So just kind of making a plug for that too, but being able to find localized information in the markets that you and your business are at play at, I think is really important. And of course, this time of year, we see a lot of different reports coming out from different organizations, whether it's, the U.S. State Department or Homeland Security. Those are, of course, really great reports I consume consistently, but different things like that I think are important to take consideration of and note of as well.
All right. Well, thank you guys for all the great questions. And I promised you a QR code to download the report. So here it is. If you have your phone handy, you can go ahead and use this QR code. Otherwise, we can get it to you in one of our follow-ups as well. So it's a quick and easy way to get it now. And again, it's called the Cascade Effect, Emerging Trends in the Threat Landscape. It's AlertMedia's 2025 Threat Outlook Report. So at this time, I just want to thank our speakers for joining us today. Sara, it's always great to hear from you with all your fascinating insights.
Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it. Happy to be here and great questions.
Yes, great questions today. Peter, thank you so much. Always love doing these with you.
Absolutely. I'm glad my voice held out.
Absolutely. Well, their email addresses are here on the screen if you did not get your question answered or you have additional questions. And that's basically our presentation for the day. So I just want to thank you all so much for coming. I hope you have a great rest of the year. And of course, I want to thank John and everyone at DRJ for having us.